Hello, everyone. I am just letting you know, please introduce yourself, say hello in the chat and everything. We would love to know who's here. Um, Today is March 29th, 2020, here at the Long Island LaRouche Committee of Correspondence meeting. Hello, everyone. We are here today with Diane Sare, the LaRouche candidate for U.S. Senate in 2022. So here's Diane Sare.
And for those of you who don't know, that's Jenny Burns, who's one of my colleagues and LaRouchePAC organizers. And do feel free to say hello in the chat box on YouTube chat and let us know you're here. So obviously this is really unpleasant to have to meet by video and not be able to be meeting in person. But I think we'll take advantage of the technology that exists, and maybe this will give us the potential to actually get a much wider reach in terms of the urgent policies and strategic overview of the LaRouche organization right now. I wanted to actually start by showing a small clip of a video from Lyndon LaRouche. It's a speech he gave in 2008. And on background to that, you should know July 25th, 2007, LaRouche delivered a very famous, very jarring webcast where he said the transatlantic financial system is over. He said there is no possibility of a non-collapse, none. And in the months that followed into the end of 2008, it became very, very clear that LaRouche was 100% correct. And unfortunately, at that time and after, the measures that he called for were not taken, but instead we continued to pump money into a system which was rotten, which was not based on the fundamental physical principles of human economy, which are the metric is life, it's mankind. LaRouche had a term, potential relative population density, that is how many people can be sustained in a given area of land. And you can imagine that if you're relying on burning wood for fuel, or if you're really barbaric and you haven't even figured out how to cook your food and you're eating maggots or something like that, a square mile of land would not sustain very many people. When you develop electricity, when you develop indoor plumbing, when you figure out ways to fertilize the ground, irrigate the ground, what you discover is through man's creativity, you are able to sustain a growing population with an improving standard of living. Now, in the 1980s, LaRouche's intelligence service, Executive Intelligence Review, produced no less than 6 reports warning about global pandemics because of the policy, which was to lower the potential relative population density, that is, the conditionalities imposed on nations by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the policies of looting nations, the policies in the United States of the so-called post-industrial economy or the environmentalist movement, that human progress is bad, we should consume less, we should have less energy, we shouldn't have nuclear power, that when you do these things, you're reducing the capability of the planet to sustain human population, and you're creating a stress on your population which makes it vulnerable to disease. So we find ourselves in a situation now where we have, as of the last count, I could get 135,530 cases of coronavirus infection in the United States. We're quickly approaching 2,500 deaths. We have so far tested, as of yesterday morning, actually about 766,000 people. So we're approaching having tested 1 million people. And the rate of infection so far is about 15.9%. But in New York, the rate of infection among people tested. This is not among the population as a whole, but among people tested, which means people with symptoms, healthcare providers, and so on. You have an infection rate of about 33.6%. In New Jersey, it's about 36%. So this part of the country that we are in is the greatest affected right now. But before going on and saying more about this, I'd like to turn to Mr. LaRouche.
The first thing to settle is that the present international monetary financial system will die and will never recover. This system is finished. The only possibility that exists now is to create a replacement system based on the principles of the founding of the U.S. economic system with the founding of the actual constitutional government, as defined under particularly Alexander Hamilton. If you don't understand and agree with Alexander Hamilton, it's like saying there is no future for you. Now, last year, I proposed in steps 3 specific remedies which are not cures of the problem, but are absolutely necessary to be put into place immediately, then, and even more so now. These 3 remedies, without that, there's no future for the United States and no future for the world. We're not looking at a depression. We're looking at what is called a general breakdown crisis. That is where money goes out of existence. It's no longer really negotiable. So-called financial assets don't exist. Everything evaporates. In a worse crisis than the type that occurred during the middle of the 14th century Europe, which was called a New Dark Age, a period which half the parishes of Europe disappeared, and 1/3 of the total population. And it was not until a half century later, with the Renaissance, that there was the beginning of a recovery of civilization, and that was almost a miracle. What we face today is a crisis which is very similar, under admittedly different historical circumstances, than that of Europe's 14th century. It's much worse, but of the same type. And without a miraculous solution, a dramatic solution, not reforms, but a dramatic, complete solution, a new system, without putting a new system of the proper design into effect immediately, not by experimenting back and forth, but by putting the system in with foreknowledge and according to prescription. Without those measures, there is no possibility that civilization will survive as civilization. Mankind would survive after a vast depopulation of the planet, probably as much as the 3.5 billion people that Al Gore and Prince Philip of England want. Remember that Al Gore is a stooge for Prince Philip. Al Gore is like Aaron Burr. Both were once vice presidents of the United States. Both were traitors to the United States on behalf of the British monarchy.
So Prince Philip, as people may know, said famously in the 80s that if he should die, he would like to be reincarnated as a deadly virus, which is why as soon as I heard about the COVID outbreak in China, I immediately checked to see if he was still living, because you never know. And a friend of mine said that the reason why the British Empire, or as it's called Commonwealth today, but it's still Empire, covers so much of the globe, and that the sun never sets on the British Empire is because you can't trust them in the dark. At any rate, just to continue in terms of the situation in the United States with the COVID-19 in the New York metropolitan area, the state of New York right now has 59,500 cases, and New Jersey has almost 14,000. To compare that with other parts of the planet, Italy now has 97,689 people infected and close to 11,000 deaths. Spain has 78,800 infected and 6,600 deaths. And as you may know, or you may have seen in the news, these situations in these countries are so dire. Not only are their hospitals completely overwhelmed and overflowing, but they have been unable to pick up the bodies of the dead. They don't have space for the corpses in the morgues, and the military has been called out to help deal with this. So I wanted to stress that because this truly is a pandemic, and in moments of crisis or in moments when you have profound change, as we do right now, because it's not only the disease, but it's the economic effects of having to cope with the disease and to shut down virtually all economic activity and all forms of people generating an income, the population becomes fearful and people become susceptible to all kinds of rumors and conspiracy theories, and lose the ability to think strategically. And what we're going to have to do is really think strategically, because this crisis is creating the circumstance where mankind could emerge from this situation much better off, with a much actually better practice of economic policy based on physical terms, not monetarist terms, and a much better collaboration of nations around the world. But that depends very much on what we do. Now, you have a situation which reminded me of a quote, which I did not have time to locate again. It might be in St. Augustine's Confessions, but there's a question about why do bad things happen to good people, and why does it seem to be the case that bad things happen to good and bad people equally? And Augustine says, this is just my memory from reading this years ago, so maybe someone can correct us in the YouTube chats if you remember the exact what he said, but that trouble is like stirring a vessel. If you have a barrel of something that smells really foul and a barrel of perfume, and when you run into adversity, it's like stirring this, and it gives off an odor, either a foul stench or a beautiful perfume, depending on the qualities of the individual who is affected. And I think you see this very clearly right now, where the European Union as a body has been completely disgusting and piggish. And you have people talking about the question of triage, of laying out guidelines of who should be saved and who should not, and maybe we should just have a do not resuscitate on everybody. Really disgusting. Meanwhile, nations like China and Russia have flown dozens of plane loads of medical doctors and equipment into Italy, probably also into Spain, into Greece. And so what you're getting is a potential disintegration of the European Union. I'm going to just read you a few quotes from some of those leaders to give you a sense of this. The president of France, Macron, said, quote, "France stands beside Italy. We won't overcome this crisis without a strong European solidarity at the health and financial levels. Are the EU, the Eurozone, reduced to a monetary institution and a collection of rules that allow each state to act on its own? If Europe can die, it is non-acting." The Italian Prime Minister says, quote, "The entire European building risks to lose its raison d'etre. Inertia would deliver the immense costs of a devastated economy to our children." The Greek Prime Minister says, "Yesterday's EU summit meeting was not equal to the occasion. Europe is up against the greatest crisis since World War II. I am referring not only to the unspeakable human tragedy where developed countries are forced to choose who will live and who will die. I'm also speaking of the economic tragedy. Italy's Lega Party chief Salvini denounced the delay of 15 days to provide any relief. Quote, "With people dying of pneumonia today, maybe of poverty tomorrow, it is anything but a union. This is a nest of snakes and jackals." So you see the ugliness of the policy, and frankly, if the European Union were to disintegrate, as Mrs. LaRouche said, and I tend to agree with her, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. The straitjacket of the European Union and European central banks was designed to actually prevent the great potential that Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche had foreseen with the reunification of Germany. Now, on the other hand, contrary to our really evilly arrogant Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, President Trump had a very good conversation with Xi Jinping, the president of China, a couple nights ago. They were on the phone for about an hour. As you may know, China was the first hit by this virus and did a rather extraordinary mobilization and basically defeated it over about a 3-month period. They did an extreme quarantine. They built 14 hospitals of 1,000 beds each in about 10 days. They did a really extraordinary mobilization, flying in 40,000 healthcare workers and others into Wuhan from all over the country. And contrary to the foolishness in the U.S. press, China very early on, yes, you could argue they fumbled in the beginning, and I'm afraid we did too. People find it hard to believe what is hitting them. But as soon as they figured out what was happening, became completely transparent and shared the genome of the virus all over the world so that people could begin collaborating on a vaccine and treatment and so on. So here's what President Trump had to say about this call. He said, "So I had a great conversation with the president of China last night. It was fascinating to me. You know, they have a whole... It's a different kind of world. It's a different form of government, to put it mildly. We talked for a long time. We talked for at least an hour. We talked about the whole concept, how it happened, when it happened, what the most effective use was. What distance was that the best thing? We talked about everything. They're ahead of us from the standpoint of time. It happened there actually a long time before it happened here. But we talked about it because he's had additional experience of having been through it much earlier. And he's developed some incredible theories, and all of that information is coming over here. A lot of it's already come, the data, and we're going to learn a lot from what the Chinese went through. So this is what President Trump has to say about the response of China and his collaboration with China. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, at a February 8th address to the Governors Association, was completely the opposite. He was actually virtually threatening the governors if any of them dared to work with China, and telling them that the United States has been monitoring what China is saying about each governor. It was almost like a McCarthyite witch hunt. So he really should be fired, as Bolton was. And you might remember what Trump said about Bolton, which is if he'd listened to him, we'd be in World War VI by now. So the last thing I just wanted to stress is a very important letter that came across from the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, because you have to understand that it's not enough. We cannot beat this by ourselves as one nation. No nation can. While it's very important that nations are sovereign and they have certain self-sufficiencies like food self-sufficiency, a machine tool sector, and so on, the world itself can be thought of almost as a biosphere, and you cannot have a disease infestation or destruction in one part of the planet without mankind as a whole being affected. So Prime Minister Ahmedi from Ethiopia writes the following, quote, There is a major flaw in the strategy to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. Advanced economies are unveiling unprecedented economic stimulus packages. African countries, by contrast, lack the wherewithal to make similarly meaningful interventions. Yet, if the virus is not defeated in Africa, it will only bounce back to the rest of the world. That is why the current strategy of uncoordinated, country-specific measures, while understandable, is myopic, unsustainable, and potentially counterproductive. A virus that ignores borders cannot be tackled successfully like this. We can defeat this invisible and vicious adversary, but only with global leadership. Without that, Africa may suffer the worst, yet it will not be the last. We are all in this together, and we must work together to the end. So I think I'll stop there, and we can go to Richard Freeman, who was on an economics task force put together by the LaRouche Movement and Executive Intelligence Review. He's been doing some research on the physical preparedness of the United States, what has to be done, and also the effect of these trillions of dollars of money pumping and liquidity going into the system right now. So, Richard, if you're there, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Jen. What I'd like to do is to show you a little bit of a battlefield report of where the United States stands in terms of our ability to fight the coronavirus, the COVID-19. And what has happened since February, when we started to know that this was a significant virus in the United States, and it's been rampaging ever since, is it tore away the mask that the United States had a functioning healthcare system. We do not. For the last 40 years, we have shut down hospitals at an alarming rate, slashed the number of hospital beds, refused to produce in advance ventilators, N5 respiratory masks, personal protective equipment, which is called PPE. And as a result, the virus has met a collapsed U.S. Physical economy and healthcare system. What Diane gave you as an earlier figure of the number of COVID-19 cases shows an actual exponential curve. On March 9th, people may not remember this, there were 637 cases. By March 20th in the United States, 18,747. And then, as Diane announced today, there's 135,000. And an exponential curve is one that starts curving and then it goes straight up. It looks like it's climbing a wall. And that's where we are. We do not know how severe this is going to get for two reasons. Number one, we have model projections saying that there will be an apex. For example, in New York State, it's predicted there'll be an apex in 3 weeks. Other places like New Orleans and Los Angeles are just beginning the surges. We don't have a single place. We have multiple places where these are breaking out. They may have a 3 to 6 to 8 week surge. Plus, we do not know whether these apexes that are being put out by model projections are accurate. What's happening is people are saying this is what happened in China, but China took rather extraordinary measures. And so far, reality has been outstripping the model projections. Helga LaRouche has called this the most significant crisis since World War II. And that features both the healthcare side and the whole coronavirus and the financial side. We are having a financial breakdown right now, worse than 2007, 2008. Then mix into it the effects that will occur with an economy that has to close down for prevention of the spread of the disease. And you're now having a breakdown level that's at breakneck speed. It would have been perhaps even without this. And this is what Lyndon LaRouche said would happen. So this is why we have something worse than what happened since World War II. I want to just give you a little bit about this, but to say that no one knew this was coming is just false. Governors are overwhelmed. You can see that, of course, in your home state, New York. but you can see it in other states as well. But no one can say that they couldn't see this coming. What was happening is that Wall Street and the City of London were tearing down the hospital system, and they were doing it in broad daylight. And they did it to the power system. They did it to the water provision system, all of which are crucial. Think of a hospital that doesn't have electricity. Think of operating in the dark without CAT scans and EKG machines and so forth. Can't be done. All of this has been torn down. I want to give you a little bit about this. The other thing is that we have had across the globe an Ebola crisis. We had an influenza H5N1 crisis, which people may remember. We had a SARS crisis. And as long as the financiers run the financial system and dictate policies, we will continue to have these crises. And the reason is, as Diane indicated, is that if you take the protein and health and other intakes below the level necessary to sustain potential relative population density, mankind is in an altered state where it is not able to meet these diseases. And these diseases, which could be contained in a healthy healthcare system with a healthy economy, cannot be blocked. And I would just recommend thinking about the Black Death. I'm not saying we're having a Black Death, but economic circumstances created in the 1430s by a breakdown of a financial system led to the Black Death cutting through the population, as Diane gave some of the figures, like a knife through butter. And that's where we are right now. Now, I'd like, if we could, David, to put up this triple curve, which I'm sure many of you have already seen. And this is a curve that Lyndon LaRouche developed, and it's very simple looking. You have your monetary aggregates, and that's basically the money supply with a few additions in the economy. You have the top curve, and you can see that, that's the middle curve. The top curve is the financial aggregates, and that's the aggregates of stocks, bonds, and an instrument called derivatives, which has been added into this like a potent mix. And that has been just growing at a tremendous rate. Our estimates is that this is over $1 quadrillion. That's $1,000 trillion, but it's a huge amount. Each one of those instruments has a rate of return. It has to be paid from somewhere. And that somewhere is the bottom curve, which is called the physical economic output, which you can think of as the productive potential and actual existence of mankind. And as they're not able to get enough rates of return on the top curve, it sucks it out through austerity and other measures of the bottom curve. Why not get rid of a hospital? It costs too much. We have to make a certain rate of return. That's part of what has been involved. So what I'd like to do is give you, as I said, just a battlefield report. But let me just say one thing. I said everyone should have seen this. Think of the red lights that were flashing. Since 1975, we have shut down 1/4 of all our hospitals. We have closed down 2/5 of all the hospital beds, and yet the population has increased. If you measure it in the narrowest terms of beds per 1,000 people, which is a roughly good gauge, we used to have 4.4 beds per 1,000 people in 1975. We have 2.3 beds per 1,000 people today. That's half of what we actually need. And as I said, that was done in clear view, and people knew it, but we didn't have the will politically to take this on as a national policy. And I just want to, as one last part of this preface, say, there are some people who have fought for hospitals. They went out and picketed the closing down the Sydenham Hospital in Harlem, New York, or the Long Island Medical College in Brooklyn. But what we have to do is to fight the entire policy that stands behind this and change it, which we can. And interestingly enough, the financial crisis has given us the perfect basis to do that. So let me just tell you a couple of things of what went wrong. After World War II, and during the 1933 to 44 period, under Roosevelt, with the Works Progress Administration and the U.S. military, we increased our hospital beds by 68%, which is tremendous. So taking that into consideration and how it was done, in 1946, the United States passed the Hill-Burton Act, which actually is called the Hospital Survey and Construction Act, but Hill and Burton were the two sponsors of it. And it said that we will, as the United States government, provide credits, loan guarantees, and so forth, so that we build enough hospitals in the United States that we meet 4.5 per thousand. Now remember, in 1975 we had 4.4, close. Today we have half of that level, and that's a disaster. But that was a policy, and you had hospital building in the 40s, in the 50s, into the early 60s. Then in 1973, the Health Maintenance Act was passed through the Congress, sponsored by the City of London, Wall Street, and the insurance companies. And they said, no, we're not going to continue that policy. Stop that. What we're going to do is we're going to set up a basis of rationing healthcare. We're going to cut costs, we're going to cut services, and we're going to put through a Malthusian policy. And that shift, which corresponded with the shift towards a post-industrial society, is what has changed rapidly every outlook that America had. And think of this with a hospital. It's part of your market basket of consumption. Now you go to the store, you buy roast beef, you buy whatever you're buying, string beans, chips, that's part of your consumption. But you have to broaden your idea that consumption includes those things which you may not think of. Without a power plant, without a hospital, you don't have certain things. That has to be part of your consumption, and we have to maintain it. So let's just look at what has happened. Over the last 15 years, there's just been bankruptcies and close downs of hospitals. I'll give one example, and I want to turn to New York City because that's the epicenter of the virus, and you can see what I'm talking about writ very large there. But for example, you have a hospital in Philadelphia, and I think we have to just broaden our view a little bit just to take in what is happening across the country. And this hospital, which is called Hanneman Hospital, it's a university hospital. It had 496 beds and a medical staff of 550. It served mostly the poor and the underserved of Philadelphia city, which is a city of 1.5 million. It had 30 medical different provisions that it did, trauma, this and that. It was taken over by a guy named Joel Friedman. You don't have to remember his name, but he was a private equity investor. And then on June 26th of 2019, he put it into bankruptcy organization. The hospital was shut down. An entire section of Philadelphia does not have a hospital. You could go to other hospitals. There's a hospital in Chicago called Metropolitan South, in a very poor district of Chicago, 314 beds, put into bankruptcy organization last year. In fact, last year was one of the record years of shutting down hospitals when we need to build them. Now, let's just look at rural hospitals where people don't have as much of a voice and they can't always defend them. From 2005 to 2019, 168 rural hospitals closed. More than half of these closed during the Obama administration. And what you have, I'll give you one example, because East Tennessee and Texas have been hit. In Tennessee, the McKenzie Regional Hospital closed in September 2018. And now families have to have a 1-hour commute to the nearest hospital if they have a car. So let's look at New York City as an example of this, because I'll give you just 2 examples of what happened in New York City, some of which Diane has already referenced. Some of you may be old enough and have gray hair like I do to remember the Big Mac, or the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which was set up as a banker's dictatorship under Felix Rohatyn of Lazard Fairbank. And they took away the power, literally, of the mayor at that time, Abraham Bean, and the city council. They said, we are now running the city. It's in a financial crisis. So what they did is they shut down hospital after hospital as they shut down New York City. Between 1960 and 1990, in New York, they had 154 hospitals in 1960. They went down to 79. Okay, that's a loss of 75 hospitals. Mike Bloomberg comes in, Mr. Mussolini himself, and shuts down another 20 hospitals between 2002 and 2013 when he's mayor. Now, that means we've lost 75 under Big Mac, 20 under Mayor Bloomberg. There may have been a few in between. That's 95 hospitals. Do you think we might be able to use them during this crisis? They're not there. They simply don't exist. On top of that, the ICU question. An ICU bed, and Governor Cuomo actually addressed this. He said, basically, an ICU bed is a bed with a ventilator. You must have a ventilator because COVID-19 is a respiratory disease. You also need telemetry and other devices in that ICU unit, but you absolutely need ventilators. So what happened was there was a debate, and this was covered in the New York Post on March 19th. And the lieutenant governor, whose name was Betsy McKay, some of you may remember her, she said, quote, "We didn't have to have a ventilator shortages. Leaders chose not to prepare for the pandemic." And she relates a story that there was a debate going on in New York State, which had medical equipment that was short by 16,000 ventilators for the New Yorkers who would need it. And they knew they would need it. As I said, these crises will sweep through us unless we put in a new Bretton Woods system of the shape that Mr. LaRouche is talking about. So they had a task force. And at that point, she pointed out in this article, they could have purchased 16,000 ventilators for $36,000 apiece. And that would have been about $756 million. Would have been about 0.5% of the New York State budget. And the budget director, Howard Zucker, the health commissioner, who's still the health commissioner, vetoed the whole thing. But no, we don't want to spend the money. So we don't have enough ventilators in New York State. So COVID-19's appearance in New York City had not have been totally stopped. That we know. But the consequent death and illness could have been greatly reduced. Bed and ventilators. But austerity triumphed over them, and we don't have them in the midst of a crisis. And now Governor Cuomo has said that we have 53,000 beds in New York. We need 140,000 beds when this crisis peaks, which he projects in about another 19 days. Well, you can do the math. We have about less than a little bit more than 1/3 of the beds we need. And there is a mobilization on that, and it's good. And he's doing the right thing on that mobilization. Now, let me just say one other thing on the ICU units, because this is very, very important. They're particularly necessary for people who are over 60. People know why. Or if you have respiratory diseases, asthma, allergies, heart disease, and things of that sort. There was a study that just came out by Kaiser Health News, released March 20th. And what it reports, shockingly, is that, quote, half of the counties in America have no intensive care beds. Half of the counties. He said this poses a danger for more than 7 million people that are over 60 who reside in those counties. And it goes through various statistics, which I won't go through now, but in some counties, like Clinton County, Michigan, has 8,469 residents for every ICU unit. Now, I looked up Long Island. As best I can tell, there's 790 residents, but it could be over 1,000 for one ICU bed. And just imagine, as this thing spreads, what are you going to do? And I'll tell you what some people want to do. They want to triage the human race. They want to say, if you're over 60, perhaps your life is not worth living anymore, which was a precept of Adolf Hitler. But that's come to the fore, and I'll mention that. Now, what is happening? Well, some governors are responding. Governor Hogan, Larry Hogan of Maryland, has said we're reopening 6,000 beds. The governors in all 50 states are trying to reopen beds on a desperate level. Andrew Cuomo of New York State has said that he has worked with people and he's planning to have hospitals, every hospital that exists, increase their beds by 50%. Where they'll put them is another question. But that should yield 27,000 beds. He's going to use the state dormitories of this state university system downstate to provide another 29,000. Javits Center, Convention Center of New York, is going to provide 2,900. The HNS Comfort, a Navy ship, is going to provide another 1,000. He's still 20,000 short on this question. This goes across the country. Now, what are we going to do? The Washington Post, on March 25th, in an article, hospitals across the U.S. consider universal do not resuscitate orders for corona patients. And this is what they report. This is one of the paragraphs. Northwestern Medical Hospital in Chicago has been discussing a universal do not resuscitate policy for infected patients, regardless of the wishes of the patients. This is a reincarnation of a policy that existed in Germany under Hitler, and it was said killing those who are not worthy, whose lives are not worthy to live. Now, a number of people, including Dr. Birx, Birx has been one of the people who's been with Trump and so forth, said this is unacceptable in America. Governor Cuomo, to his credit, said, "I swear to you, I will never do that." But this came from the Imperial College of London, which came up with a dual-edged strategy saying, this is what we'll do. And this was done in Britain, by the way. This is an insane strategy. We're going to get herd immunity. What does that mean? We will let the virus infect up to 60% of the population, and then there will be a natural resistance. Sounds like a policy? Perhaps, except you're going to kill tens of thousands of people before the infection rate gets up to 60%. Or the alternative is do not resuscitate, euthanasia, kill the elderly. If we do that, we throw out the principles of civilization. We throw out the principles of America and the defense of human life, and for which we stand. This policy is based on the idea of a fixed universe, that you have fixed resources, you have fixed diseases, and the way this works, and this is the way City of London and Wall Street tend to work, they create a shortage, they create policies over 40 years of takedown of everything that's vital in America, including our productive capacity as well. Then, as those things are inadequate, as we're in an inadequate situation to deal with the crisis, which could have been dealt with, they then say, well, now you don't have any choice. You must adopt a do not resuscitate. But we're mankind. We don't live in a universe that's fixed. We don't live with fixed resources. We don't live with fixed capabilities. And what we need to do is completely reverse that. And I will just mention one thing here, and very briefly, something on the financial crisis. And then if there's more questions, there's much more that can be said on the financial crisis, including what Roosevelt did on the first couple of days, which are very important to deal with this thing. But what we need to do is to put the financial system that exists right now through bankruptcy reorganization. We will, as long as this cancer dominates our country's policy and the country's policies in the globe, you cannot follow a policy of hospital building. We need to build hospitals on a mass mobilization that will restore 700,000 permanent new hospital beds. These hospitals should be equipped, fully equipped. They should be modern. They should have equipment which is based on the electromagnetic spectrum's characteristics. And by what I mean by that, there are things like optical biophysics and so forth, where you're not just using drugs. You're tuning the body, which is part of this, can be adjusted very much so to the electromagnetic spectrum. And you're using advanced scientific principles to take on the diseases. This is something Mr. LaRouche called for back in 1974 when he set up a biological pandemic, a biological Holocaust task force, knowing that these things would occur, knowing that SARS and Ebola and now COVID-19 would occur, as anybody who is intelligent must know. That would not only be done under the Hill-Burton Act, it could be done under the Defense Production Act, which some of you may have heard about. It's been talked about by President Trump and others, under which you could give accelerated tax and amortization credits to hospitals that build this. We could also set up what was done under Roosevelt, and I'll just mention it here and talk about it later, maybe in the question period, of a Reconstruction Finance Corporation as the form of a Hamiltonian bank, which could then set up a health development corporation to supplement Hill-Burton and so forth. But this gigantic speculative bubble must be pierced. Now, do I have, Diane, time to say 5 minutes, or should I just stop on what that bubble looks like?
Go ahead.
Okay. Let me just say something on this bubble so that you know what we're talking about, because you hear about it, and I showed you on the curve that was presented earlier as LaRouche's triple curve. And LaRouche said is wipe out the first curve or reduce it down to some level that actually makes sense. Yeah, that's the curve. The corporate bond market, which is $10 trillion, so it's in the United States, it's a fairly important market. It's one of the two means by which corporations raise money when they need it to expand plant and equipment and so forth. This is just teetering on the edge. The week before last, $32 billion were taken out of corporate bond funds. As far as I could tell from Bloomberg's news service, that's the largest amount ever taken out in a single week. What has happened is that many bonds, which were genuinely decent bonds, have been reduced to junk bonds. By the end of last week, 2/3 of the corporate bond market is below BBBE, junk bonds. What's a junk bond? A junk bond is a risky bond in which the company may not have the revenue stream to pay back. So we're talking about 6.7 trillion out of the $10 trillion corporate bond market is now in that category. What we thought was buried has come out of the grave. The mortgage-backed security crisis of 2007, 2008 is coming back, and these are called MBS, or mortgage-backed security. They have been failing. The $3.3 trillion hedge fund industry is in trouble. And if you've been getting reports from Diane and others about the fact that the Federal Reserve has been spending huge amounts of money through the repurchase market, part of that has been trying to stabilize the hedge fund industry, and this has been going on since September 16th of last year. It is not working. In this setting, there are many other layers and so forth, which I could go through. People have loaded up on corporate debt since the last crisis. We had 6.4 trillion in corporate debt and household debt. We now have 9.5 trillion. People just putting things on their credit card to survive as living standards have fallen. When this goes, and it is going, if the bond market has fallen 17% since February, and that's what's happened, everyone's focused on the stock market, but these are other markets which are equally as large and so forth. As that falls, it will not only fall, but will trigger what is called the derivatives market, and I'll explain later what they are, but they're bets. But we now have about 760 trillion with a T of these bets. As those bets unwind, and they must, and they started to do that in 2007, 2008, then the whole financial system disintegrates. It's like a fire. It gets very, very hot, and suddenly a brick building is ashes. That's what we're in the middle of. We're not starting it. We're in the middle of it. And then corporate debt will go, and we will have a generalized collapse. The alternative presented by the Federal Reserve is insane. It says, let's bail out a speculative market worldwide of over 1 quadrillion. It can't be done. Morally, it should not be done. It is garbage. It is cancer. Why bail out a cancer? Cut it out. If we have the courage and intelligence to do that, and just sweep it aside, reorganize the banking system. Don't bail it out, reorganize. Don't bail it out. We have precedents from Alexander Hamilton, as Mr. LaRouche said in the clip that you saw, under Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, under Roosevelt through the Reconstruction Corporation, where you set up an entirely new system. You wipe off, and Citibank and others are going to lose 40 to 50, 60% of their assets. Don't worry. If the United States government steps in intelligently, we will protect people's deposits, savings accounts, the ability to write payroll, the ability to make loans to businesses, to agriculture, to homes. Not everything will be saved. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation only has a fraction of what's needed. But we will get to a higher ground. Think of being in a flood, a total flood, and you have a system where you can put together, putting credit for anti-entropic growth, building the Moon Mars Artemis system, building fusion power, building high-speed rail, and building 1,500 to 2,000 hospitals with 700,000 beds of the most modern physical capabilities and machines, so that we redress this crisis. If we do this here, if we do it in Africa, which absolutely needs it, in Asia, and so forth, and we make a global reorganization with the 4 presidents of India, China, United States, and Russia doing this, and in those countries, then we will have a situation where we can ensure that we will never again have a COVID-19 crisis or anything like that ever again. And those are the steps that must be taken. Yes, there are local steps. Yes, there are statewide steps. But it's this fundamental step of getting out of a cancerous system that is sucking the lifeblood out of this country and the world. That is ultimately the final step, which conjoined with those other steps, is where we have to go.
Great, thank you very much for that. So we did get a couple of comments, and well, we got a comment and a question. The first comment comes from Guy. He says, "We need to put the economic firewall now. We need to put up the economic firewall now. The firewall is HR 2176, the Return to Prudent Banking Act. We need only 50 more co-sponsors to force it to the floor of the House for a vote. We also need HR 2176 introduced to the Senate, and we need 30 co-sponsors to force it to the Senate floor for a vote." Do you have anything to say about that?
I think it would be a helpful step. I think one thing about it is Mr. LaRouche has emphasized that the Glass-Steagall, and that's the name, as I'm sure Guy knows this, a reintroduction of the Glass-Steagall bill. He has advocated for a simple bill because the principles should be there. I've looked at the other bills. I think that might benefit from simplicity, where you emphasize the principles. But I think the idea is correct. We must separate out worthless assets, which should just be written off. If a bank was foolish enough to buy mortgage-backed securities or credit default swaps or other things like that, it's their responsibility. It's people first. We don't sacrifice lives to these financial instruments. But I would just say to Guy, and I think that's a promising step, we need a Glass-Steagall bill, absolutely, and we've called for that in the 4 laws that Mr. LaRouche enunciated. You need simultaneously, and this is where I think what Diane was referring to and Helga Zepp LaRouche has absolutely referred to, you have to have simultaneously physical projects that you want to build and instrumentalities to Hamiltonian credit to put the money into those projects. And I identified a few of them, like if we build a fusion power economy, you will transform absolutely the entire manifold of everything that goes on in the economy. So that we should be thinking in 2 ways. And I think, Guy, what you're saying is, it's correct. But we have to think in terms of this system is not just dying. We're in that transition. Think of yourself moving out of an old world paradigm and into a new world one. We're in the middle of it. And we must, as responsible people using forethought, identify those projects and also simultaneously, with the Glass-Steagall bill, put together the Hamiltonian system, whether we call it a national bank, like the first national bank of the United States, which was in existence in the first 20 years of our existence, or a Reconstruction Finance Corporation. We must get that passed simultaneously or bring it along with these other projects so that we take it as a total package.
Great, thank you. And so the next question looks like it's a 2-part question from Bob. He says, "Thanks, great work. It keeps me grounded among all the noise. Can you please explain how the helicopter money / bailout of the casino threatens hyperinflation?" And the second part of the question is, what's the difference between speculative and derivative?
Okay, good. Yeah, helicopter money, we've had it actually, but there was a proposal by a firm. Let me just say one thing. We're already in this phase. The U.S. Federal Reserve, I'd say 2007, had assets, meaning instruments it bought up, largely treasuries, on its own books. And that was fine. That's perfectly legitimate, of about 700 billion. This went through the roof, and during the 2007-2008 crisis and subsequently, we reduced them down a little bit, but I just saw a figure in one of the financial press, I think it was the Wall Street Journal or somewhere, that we're now at 5.3 trillion. What the Federal Reserve has already been doing is buying every piece of junk. You thought mortgage-backed securities helped create, wasn't the only thing, but helped create the 2007-2008 crisis. It did. We now have on our books, on the Federal Reserve, anywhere, it's hard to get the exact information, between 200 billion and half a trillion of mortgage-backed security. You might say, why would the Federal Reserve want to own something which most people know is junky? I mean, it's terrible. Why would you want to buy something terrible? Everyone who's on this call would not go out and buy one of these pieces of paper. You know how risky they are because they're bailing out the system. Other things like that have been, so 5.3 trillion. And I would say that they have a term called bad bank. When sometimes when you are trying to, this is not the way to do it really, but some ways if your bank is in big trouble, you divide it in two banks. You put the good assets on the one side, you put the bad assets in what's called the bad bank. We really shouldn't do that. We should really wipe out the financial bad assets and just write them down to market. I mean, if someone protests from a bank like Chase Manhattan Bank, if Jamie Dimon, who's the head of it, says, well, you can't do that to us. Well, we'll say, well, go out and try and sell these in the market. That's all you're going to get. We're going to just value them. We don't want to buy them out. The biggest bad bank in the world right now is none of these other banks. It's the Federal Reserve. In the last 3 weeks, according to calculations that my colleague Paul Gallagher has done, the Federal Reserve, in addition to what it put on its books, has pumped in $3.2 trillion. And in the stimulus bill, the $2.2 trillion stimulus bill, which just passed the Senate and House, there is the largest amount. It's for a special facility. It has $454 billion. In other words, there's stuff in there. There's $130 billion for hospitals. There's money there for small businesses, and that's good. That's correct. But the biggest single amount is $454 billion out of that $2.2 trillion, which will go to a special facility at the Federal Reserve. And Steve Mnuchin, who's our Treasury Secretary, said that can be multiplied by 10 times. So he's talking about a $4.5 trillion facility. We don't know as yet whether that $4.5 trillion includes the $3.2 trillion that was spent last week, or the last 3 weeks, that was pumped out into the system in repurchase agreements and special other facilities that the Federal Reserve has. It has several facilities. Most people don't even know they exist. But whether that $4.5 trillion will be inclusive of that $3.2 trillion or not. But the thing is, if you have a financial system that is so rotten, whatever it is, whether it includes the $3.2 trillion or doesn't, what's going to happen, whoever's asking this question, is that's just the first installment. What are we going to do next for a follow-up after that only lasts 2 or 3 weeks? A $10 trillion facility? And if that sounds crazy, don't think it's crazy. Who would have thought $5.2 trillion would be spent to bail out banks and hedge funds and private equity firms? And then you're off to the races. And then you're in a situation, and I could go through because I did a study of this, but the principle is very clear of what happened in Weimar Germany, where the money supply, because they were trying to save assets, increased 10 billion times between March of 1923 and in November of 1923. That produces an asset inflation. And people have all seen pictures of taking a wheelbarrow to the store of what were then Reichsmarks to buy a loaf of bread. And that won't work. That means every asset you have that you think you've earned by working very hard for 60 to 70 years of your life, in which you did work very hard, or built up your business, or saved, husband and wife did it for their children, that's gone. That's worthless. That's what we're on the verge of. I'm not trying to frighten people. I'm just saying we have to have forethought and calmly look at this. Now, the helicopter money, I'll just very briefly say what it is. There's a company called BlackRock Management. You may have heard of it, you may not have. It is far bigger than Goldman Sachs or anything. It has $7 trillion under management. It dwarfs anything else. And last August, it put forth a proposal at something that's called the Jackson Hole meeting, which is in Wyoming, where they get all the central bankers of America and many of the big bankers, and they go out to this place in Wyoming. It's sponsored by the Kansas City Federal Reserve. And they put out a proposal that said lowering interest rates, and as you may know, we're very close to zero, and other mechanisms like these bailouts still may not work. So what we're going to do is we're going to kidnap the Congress and we're going to say fiscal policy will now be put into place to support helicopter money. And they use that phrase in the BlackRock endorsed statement, helicopter money. And if you think of helicopter money, just think of somebody flying over and tossing out dollar bills. You know, it's an hilarious image, but this is an image they're using. It's not, money literally being thrown out of a helicopter. And what it would do is that the Congress, the budget, instead of being used to build Artemis, the Moon Mars mission, or fusion, would be, and they say that this is the words, permanently dedicated, permanently changes. They call this regime change. They use the term regime change, where you throw out leaders. Well, this would be done as a regime change in the United States. It would be permanently changed to backstop whatever new money would have to be printed. So the income streams from your taxes and business taxes and other people's stuff would then be diverted to putting out money they think this would get money into people's hands. So some of it would be handed to people, but much of it would be to bail things out. So as bad as what I've just told you, of 4.5 trillion being just put into the 454 billion, but would be multiplied 10 times, that's 4.5 trillion in the bill that was just done, the stimulus bill. You're now talking about a facility which would capture the function of the United States government. We would not have a United States government functioning. The sequela to this is 3 days ago, the Federal Reserve announced that they had set up some bailout facilities and they wanted it to be done well. So they brought in as the manager of these facilities, this was reported by the Wall Street Journal and everyone else, BlackRock. So the financial oligarchy of the City of London and Wall Street have just put into the Federal Reserve a company whose principle is this helicopter money, and they know they can control it. And so they're signaling that is the future policy. And again, human beings, not this garbage. Don't build it out. You can't do it. It's like there's this story of Croesus who went to the seashore and tried to shout over the waves. Well, if you've gone to Rockaway Beach or something like that, you can't shout over the waves. Bailing it out is worse than Croesus by 1,000 times. Get rid of it and be reorganizing on the principles that Lyndon LaRouche identified in that clip that you just saw, and that Helga LaRouche is spearheading for a new world financial system or credit system.
Great, thank you. So I just got word Diane also wants to have something to say.
I want to underscore, and I think Richie's already getting at this, is the arbitrary nature of the bailouts. And a lot of people are very panicked right now, understandably so. I mean, imagine if you're running a restaurant in this crisis, you're only allowed to do takeout. You cannot pay any of your staff or your waiters or waitresses. You have people that you care about that you're being forced to lay off without pay. The government may be paying them. That might take some time. Maybe they can't pay their rent. The landlords, presuming it's a slumlord, not a slumlord, can't pay their property taxes. In other words, you can see this kind of chain reaction where everything just implodes, and this is creating panic where people are saying things, oh, this is really a fraud. This is just a normal flu virus. Why do we have to shut down our businesses? You have the poor, pathetic lieutenant governor of Texas who said, look, we should just reopen the businesses. This is just too bad for the economy. And I'd be willing to die for my children to have an economy. And I'm sure lots of people with grandchildren would be happy to drop dead so that our children can inherit nothing. Because the truth of the matter is, if you don't fight for the sanctity of human life now, if you don't have an economy which values the development of human beings as its number one priority, there will be nothing left for your grandchildren, and they'll be dead by the time they're 20. And this really has to be understood, because you see it all over the place, people saying, oh, well, isn't it unconstitutional to shut down businesses? Well, actually, the preamble of the Constitution it says that the reason we have a government is to defend the general and promote the general welfare. And it talks about the question of our posterity. That is, the purpose of the government is actually not only the protection of the population today, but future generations. And if you think about your restaurant, well, what is in the restaurant? There's food, there's chicken or beef that comes from somewhere in the Midwest. There's people who deliver this. There's plates and dishes and silverware that's manufactured somewhere. There's an edifice, a structure that needs electricity, that needs running water. All of these things actually exist in the real world, and they are not money. The question of the money is an arbitrary question. As LaRouche used to say, money is an idiot. And I think this comes in one of the questions, and Richard, I would like you to say more about this, is this question of bankruptcy reorganization, because I think we can't emphasize enough that it seems to me you're going to have to go through, as FDR did, state by state. I guess they had state authorities looking into the balance sheets of the banks, but you're going to have to go from some level on the ground up to the top level and put the whole thing through a bankruptcy reorganization to kind of clear the rubble away and let people function afterwards, but not function in the way they were doing before, because what we did before will lead us into this disaster again, but on a new system. But could you say something about this question of bankruptcy reorganization, a hypothesis or first stab at what that might look like?
Yeah, and what Diane said is absolutely the case. I mean, these are physical things that exist in restaurants and so forth. Physical processes. We have to preserve those. I mean, this is human life, which is why an economy exists. An economy produces many things, but it's to produce human beings of a higher quality, a higher cognitive quality, and each generation of a higher level than the ones before. I'll just say something briefly about what Roosevelt did to give a sense of this. The Glass-Steagall Act, which Helga LaRouche has put in almost every one of her calls, is essential. But there's a companion piece, which I think we might want to consider as well. It goes along with the Glass-Steagall Act, and it's called the Banking Act. And it's a very simple act, and it is a reorganization act on the principles. Lyndon LaRouche's idea of it is a higher idea, but at least it gets some of the elementary features. So in the 1933 period, 1/5 of all the banks had gone under by February of 1933. Back then, the president used to come into office on March 4th. Now it's in January, but back then it was the 4th. And before he came in, 48 states had declared bank holidays, and New York and Illinois, which were the two biggest banking states, declared bank holidays on the 4th. So Roosevelt took assumed the presidency, rather, and there were no banks open. The New York Stock Exchange was closed. Chicago Mercantile Exchange was closed. Every financial institution in America was closed. So what he did is he declared a national bank holiday. And that was done on the 6th of March. So he's in office 2 days. And then what he did, which is quite fascinating, he put together the National Banking Act. And I'll just describe the bare bone principles, but I think everyone will get it. It's actually a very humorous scene. The Congress opens. It had a lot of new people. They didn't even know where their seats were. There were only about 4 or 5 copies of this act, and there were erasures on it. And people are literally, one description is kind of funny. People are climbing over the seats trying to find where they're supposed to sit as members of the House of Representatives, and they're trying to circulate this act. The important thing was that it was introduced in the morning of March 6th, and it was passed and signed into law by the evening. And this tells you something. America does have the constitutional principles to do something on an emergency basis and get itself into gear when it needs to. Now, what it did is it set up under the Office of Control of Currency, it appointed conservators whose job was to look at the banks, which are solvent, which aren't. And what it did, therefore, is they were assigned to go through the books. I think Mr. LaRouche will go through the books a little bit more thoroughly, but the principle is absolutely correct. And you have to also imagine that some of the assets that these banks had already disappeared over the period 1929 to 33. In any event, by March 15th, 70% of the roughly 18,000 nationally chartered banks had been opened. That means it was opened 9 days after the National Banking Act was done. And these are the provisions of the National Banking Act. By a little bit later in April, 76% of all the banks were open in the United States. And then 1,100 banks were put in bankruptcy. They just didn't have the ability to carry this work out. The conception was protect as much as possible existing deposits, and people had lost a lot. Deposits, checking accounts, whatever existed, ability to write payroll had to be preserved. These are the functions of the bank. Forget everything else. Ability to write loans to agriculture, to industry, to housing, and so forth. There are other ancillary things which are quite important, but I would say keep those principles in mind because that's what we're looking to do. Banks may be reduced 60% in assets, but once they start to operate, they're going to have real assets, companies that function, rather than paper assets which are not worth much. This was what was done. And then this Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which I'll just mention, was originally set up in 1932 by President Herbert Hoover to bail out banks, bail them out. Roosevelt said, well, I'm going to turn this around. I can't pass through legislation for a national bank like Hamilton. I'll just change what this function does. And it didn't have to go back to Congress time and time again to get new money. So once it was appropriate, it keep lending and so forth. And so what it did is it bought up some of the stock of banks, not bailed them out. So we will hold the stocks of the bank. They put conditions on how much, all sorts of things that the bank was only allowed to do, and so forth. This Reconstruction Finance Corporation then was used along with the Public Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration, Civilian Conservation Corps, the building of the Grand Coulee Dam, the building of the Tennessee Valley Authority, real physical projects of anti-tropic growth. You have to do both at the same time. You can't just preserve banks as if they were floating in the air. You have to have something they could lend to. And it put out money, and the budget of the United States put out money. And I'll just tie this together. This Reconstruction Finance Corporation also provided the money for World War II. It was a Hamiltonian institution, a Roosevelt Hamiltonian institution. Between 33 and 45, it put $33 billion of credit into the United States economy. That was more credit than all the commercial banks in the United States together, new credit that they lent at that time. In other words, the RFC, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, lent more than all the commercial banks in the United States. And by pouring these funds out and getting projects moving, then commercial banks came in and they made loans because they knew that something had a government backing, that it was useful for human existence, and they lent and they started to revive, and now these banks had assets. But to directly answer Diane's question, I do believe to go along with the Glass-Steagall Act, a National Banking Act, which would allow us to sort out within 10 to 14 days those banks that can work, provide government backup for real functions, not for speculative functions. That would be a procedure we would follow today. And if we did it, and we had President Trump with the support of people in the Congress saying, we've got to do this, no fooling around, we've got to function, we could do it. There might be varied, it might be changed, but those are the principles.
Great, thank you. So we're about to wrap up, so I'm gonna just read the newest things that came in. The first one says from James, "Hi Diane, thank you for having this video conference. I am just amazed at the amount of information. The philosophies, ideas, and opinions shared are so thought-provoking. God bless you, great people." And then Bob says, "Please explain the difference between the Fed and the Treasury." And and he also says, "I fully understand Glass-Steagall and a new Bretton Woods, but how does this happen when the criminals/bankers like BlackRock run the show?"
I'll make this very quick because I think Diane will want to say something. Their power is gone. Their financial system is gone. You put us through bankruptcy reorganization, which is what Diane was saying, and let's be really clear, bankruptcy reorganization on Hamiltonian principles. Don't bail out. They've disintegrated. They either go with what the policy of the president and our legislature says, or they're out of existence. We might save Chase Manhattan if they do what we said. If not, we will come in, protect the deposits, checking accounts, and goodbye, Jamie Dimon.
Great. And so Diane has some concluding comments.
Great. Well, I think what people are asking really gets at why I decided to run for U.S. Senate and also what everyone here has to do, because their system is completely finished. That's what we're seeing, and they can print all the money they want, and actually the more they print, the worse it will get. People getting individual checks and things may help to alleviate some pain for a few seconds, but it's just not going to work. Now, happily, we're also getting a good lesson, because if you look at the scope of the mobilization to provide hospital beds, you get a glimmer that there's still a potential here in the United States. If you have leadership, President Trump's collaboration with the governors, President Trump's willingness to reach out to Xi Jinping and work with China and Russia in spite of our virtually treasonous Secretary of State, indicates what you can do. Think about what was reported, what we're looking at, turning the Javits Center into a hospital with 2,900 beds. I guess the Army has called up 900 retired Army medical specialists who are going to, and you don't want to put people over 60 in the front lines with all the coronavirus patients. So I think what they're doing is they're coming in to replace the people on our military bases and so on. And those people who are active duty are going to be sent all over the country to address this. So what you see is, while we have over the last 60 years drastically destroyed our physical ability to respond, nonetheless, we still have a certain reservoir of talent, of goodwill, of generosity, where people will move and they will act. And I think fundamentally most Americans don't agree with the Lieutenant Governor of Texas that we don't have to kill our grandmothers and great uncles in order to save business. And in fact, that will not work. But what we actually have to do is create a new system, that we have to resolve that when we come through this crisis, which may be a few months. It may be, if we don't take the action we need, like the Prime Minister of Ethiopia said, and do everything possible to halt the spread of disease in places like Brazil and places in the Southern Hemisphere, it's going to come back in the fall. So we have to address this globally. But at the point that we have come through this, what do we have? Are we going to go back and say, oh, well, let's try and live the same old degenerate, broken down life we had before? Well, that's a disaster. It won't work. We have to establish a new system, which is what LaRouche called for. That is, namely, the United States, Russia, China, India, as the four leading powers and also scientific powers, have to put the entire global system through bankruptcy and establish a kind of a Bretton Woods and Glass-Steagall bank separation, but also fixed exchange rates, no more gambling on currencies, and then a crash program to increase the potential relative population density of the planet as a whole, new modern infrastructure, nuclear power, fusion research, emphatically space exploration, so that we take this moment when everything is going to disintegrate, and in a sense it's almost a kind of a blessing. And I don't mean that for the lives that we will lose, which is really tragic and should not have happened. But I think these Wall Street crooks, the Jeffrey Epsteins of the world and Jamie Dimons of the world, were not going to say, oh, you know what, you're right, I've been an immoral pig, and I think we should just reorganize. That would not have happened. The only way that you would get to a situation where you could reestablish the American constitutional system of credit, as Lyndon LaRouche uniquely understood it, is through this kind of collapse. So we have the collapse. Now we've got to reorganize. And I want to tell everybody who's listening and all of your friends, on April 25th and 26th, we're not going to have another Long Island committee meeting in the next month, because on April 25th and 26th, there's going to be a major, very powerful international conference keynoted by Mrs. LaRouche with some very high-level and prominent speakers. As she said yesterday, we may reveal the names of some of them as we get closer, but very, very prominent. And it's going to be the kind of global dialogue that needs to be had, perhaps a model for the upcoming summit of Presidents Trump, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Prime Minister Modi. And it's going to be from 11 a.m. until 6 p.m., Saturday and Sunday that weekend, because we want to make it possible for people from all over the world and all different time zones to be involved in that. So I urge everyone to go to the LaRouchePAC.com website to look it up. Also, I would strongly encourage people to contribute to LaRouchePAC on LaRouchePAC.com, and also be in touch about subscribing to the Daily Alert that we produce, the Executive Daily Alert, which is part of Executive Intelligence Review. So that's what I have, and I'd like to really thank Jenny for moderating today and helping us, and Richard Freeman for sharing your expertise. And I hope that all of you make a point to put aside that weekend of April 25th and 26th and be with us at the conference. Thank you.